This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the best all-in-one platform for any of your website building needs. Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today we're gonna be talking about anime. Again, because what else do I even do on this channel? To be more specific though, we're gonna be talking about something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Whether or not anime art is, contrary to popular belief, actually harder than realism. I mean, the obvious answer is no. The techniques and skills required to depict a subject realistically are vastly more difficult and complex than those required to draw anime in almost every way. And anyone would be forgiven for seeing that obvious fact and closing the door on that discussion, concluding quickly and simply that realism is the harder form of art by far. But the reason I've been thinking about this so often recently is because that's really never been my experience with it. Most of you know by now that I've been working as an artist to varying degrees of success for a long time. What a lot less of you probably know is that contrary to what the digital anime art style I'm known for now might have you believe, I actually started with realistic drawings and paintings, usually of animals, flowers, landscapes, and master study recreations. Don't get me wrong, I've always drawn anime too. I may have started with dogs and flowers as a kid, but the moment I hit middle school, those took a back seat to sketchbooks upon sketchbooks full of fan art of Inuyasha, Durarara, Death Note, Fruits Basket, Lucky Star, Blue Exorcist. I could go on for way too long, but the point is that there was a lot of it, and that naturally carried on as I grew up. Throughout high school, I was drawing anime constantly as my passion for it grew with me, and I loved it. It was mostly a hobby, but I did dream of pursuing it professionally one day. By the time I graduated, I had definitively decided that art was what I wanted to do as a career. But when it came to defining what that actually meant for me on a technical level, I was a lot less sure. I mean, ever since I'd found anime in middle school and started drawing it, I knew that was what I loved the most. The style, the characters, the whole vibe. It was what I got the most enjoyment out of, by far. But I had been drawing realism since I was 6 and I first started. And because of my eidetic memory, it was what I was best at. I've always found it easy to depict things as they are in reality in art because of how clearly I could visualize them in my head and compare them to my memories of similar subject matter. But it was a lot harder for me to stylize that subject matter to suit styles like those of anime and graphic novels. It's always been easy for me to replicate reality in art, but incredibly difficult for me to accurately and consistently distort and exaggerate the proportions of a subject to suit a less realistic style, which is why I've always struggled with facial proportions in particular. After all, an anime body is still relatively realistic in terms of proportions, but an anime face most definitely is not. And when I look at the level of skill demonstrated by my realistic art versus my stylized anime art, even after years spent practicing and trying to improve the latter, the difference is still immense. While something like this painting, well, it's not a painting, it was done with Copics actually, but still, was done within an hour or two, I could have spent that same amount of time just sketching a face in an anime style and still not have it turn out right. I can confidently say that I'm good at realism. I can't confidently say that I'm good at stylization. I'm getting better, and I'll give myself some leeway and say that I'm at least mediocre at it, but there's a mental block between my ability to apply my understanding of the fundamentals to realism and my ability to apply it to stylized work. I just can't do it. It doesn't come naturally to me, even if it's the style I vastly prefer. And I wanted to know why, because quite frankly, it bugs me. And since I'm making drawing anime my career rather than painting realistically, it felt like a reasonable problem to want to investigate a little further and hopefully find some kind of resolution to. That's why in today's video, I'm going to go over my thoughts on the question of whether or not stylized art, anime just being one example of it, is more difficult than realism, from the perspective of someone who has always found that to be the case, despite all logical reasoning suggesting that I shouldn't. But before I do, let me take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace, a longtime partner of this channel. I've had the privilege of working with them for so long now that some of you guys are so used to hearing me gush about them that when a video starts without me talking about Squarespace, comments pop up immediately expressing concern for my well-being and seeking reassurance that I haven't been kidnapped, or worse, that I've broken up with Squarespace. Because the running joke that we're married has been going on for a ridiculous amount of time at this point. And I support the joke, because if I could marry a sponsor, it would be Squarespace. Since I've been using their platform myself for so long now that I can confidently say that at least in my opinion, they're the best website building and hosting platform out there. I created my portfolio there where it's currently hosted, something they made so easy and straightforward that they are always my first recommendation for artists looking to build their own. There is no better way to display your art than with a beautiful, professional looking Squarespace site. And they have such an extensive library of gorgeous templates that it's easy to find the perfect one to start building it from. And not only do they have a whole section of them just dedicated to portfolios for all of you artists out there, that's just the beginning. Whether you want to build a versatile online store, a blog to connect to your community, a landing page for your business, or anything else you could imagine, Squarespace has a template that's perfect for it. And once you found it, it's easier than ever to customize every part of it to suit your needs using Fluid Engine, their next generation editing system that allows you to easily and smoothly edit every aspect of your site with its user-friendly drag and drop interface. And it's just as easy to turn whatever site you build into a fully functional online store with built-in e-commerce and print-on-demand integration, letting you sell everything from physical goods to digital content and letting your customers pay with anything from credit cards to PayPal and Apple Pay, and, in eligible countries, flexible long-term payment alternatives like Afterpay and ClearPay. And all of that's just the beginning. With SEO options designed to get your site to reach as many people as possible, visual design tools to help you build brand recognition, social media account connectivity, and so much more, Squarespace offers every tool you could possibly need to bring your dream site to life. And you can find out yourself by going to squarespace.com/DuchessCelestia, linked in the description, and use code DuchessCelestia for 10% off your first domain purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and please go check them out. All that out of the way, let's get into the video. When I ask the question, is anime art harder than realism, what I'm really asking is whether or not stylized art as a whole is harder than realism, since anime is really just one example of artistic stylization. Cartoons, graphic novels, caricatures, Western animation, even abstract, any type of art that is, by design, not supposed to be an accurate representation of reality, but rather an exaggerated reinterpretation of it, falls into that category. And for a long time, there's been a mostly unspoken but widely agreed upon understanding that because stylized art is generally simpler and less technically accurate than its realistic counterpart, it's significantly easier to make. And it's not hard to understand why. Realism is hard. To depict something with photorealistic accuracy in art requires finely honed skills that take years and years of focused, disciplined, consistent study to develop. It's more than just seeing a subject and drawing it. You can't draw it accurately, at least not to the degree that realism demands, if you're just observing a subject. Observation is certainly a big part of it, but it's just the beginning. To accurately replicate reality in art, one doesn't just have to observe it, but also understand why it looks the way it does. This means understanding values, anatomy, light and shadow, and all of the basic fundamentals, because if you don't have that understanding, the observations you make of the subject matter will be insufficient to inform your ability to depict it. While stylized art is more forgiving of fundamental inaccuracies in this regard and allows you to simplify the manner in which you depict the subject matter you're viewing, realism, conversely, forces you to understand your subject visually and artistically, and not just on an aesthetic level, but an analytical level, so the manner in which you draw it is correct. Furthermore, the techniques required to do so are fairly objectively more difficult than those used in more stylized work. While an anime artist and a realism artist both need the same understanding of light and shadow to apply shading and highlights to their subject, the manner in which an anime artist applies it via simplified cell shading is going to be vastly less difficult, time-consuming, and effort-intensive than the manner in which a realism artist would, as their methods aim not just to depict where the light and shadow would fall, but exactly how they would fall in reality, with as much true-to-life accuracy as possible. Especially as someone who's worked with both realism and stylization extensively, it's difficult, if not impossible, not to acknowledge that on a purely technical level, realism is much harder, simply because the techniques required of it are harder to master and execute. The level of detail involved in its depiction is more than worth mentioning as well, as realism is objectively much more complex in that regard than stylization. Since stylization doesn't require an artist to depict a subject exactly as it looks in reality, but rather just enough like it to be recognizable as whatever it is, a lot of detail can be sacrificed so long as enough is kept to maintain that recognizability. I could draw this, and you would know that it's a necklace, even if that necklace actually looks like this in reality. In an anime style, that simplification and removal of complex details isn't just forgivable, it's expected. In realism, it's not. Every detail of a subject that is observable in reality is expected to be present in a realistic depiction of it in art, and it's that level of mandatory detail that presents another way in which realism is, objectively, harder than stylization. The more complexity that needs to not just be included, but be depicted as accurately as possible, the more difficult and time-consuming it will be to do so. And in that regard, it's similarly difficult, if not impossible, to ignore that stylization, which requires neither that complexity nor that accuracy, is easier. Finally, because realism aims to replicate reality and its quality is largely determined by how accurately it does so, there's a very high bar to meet with your art that is very difficult to reach. With stylized art, it's not being directly compared to reality. So if it fails to be accurate to it, that isn't necessarily something that's held against it when judging quality. With realism, that's very far from the case. Not only are we constantly comparing it directly to reality, we're judging whether or not it's good based on how close that comparison is. And since we're acutely aware of how things look in reality as a result of being constantly surrounded by it, we're innately fine-tuned to notice even the subtlest of ways in which art falls short of imitating it accurately. We see so many faces every day that we can pretty easily pinpoint the mistakes a realism artist makes when they draw a portrait portrait, since we're actively comparing it to the plethora of examples our brains have stored of how that portrait should look. When we look at Inuyasha or a Picasso painting or Louise from Bob's Burgers, we're not comparing their faces to any that we've seen before, so none of the ways they fail to look like those faces are considered to be shortcomings or mistakes. We expect stylized art to deviate so much from reality that we don't compare it to it when judging its quality, and we're subsequently much more forgiving of any technical inaccuracies. That same leeway is not offered to realism artists, making it much more difficult to complete a piece in which mistakes are not immediately obvious and criticized simply by way of comparing the subject it depicts to a real-life example of it. The standard to which we hold realism is much higher than the standard to which we hold stylization in this regard, and meeting it is obviously much harder as a result. But the direct comparison between realism and reality is a coin with two sides. On one hand, as we've already discussed, one must acknowledge that by way of being subjected to that comparison, realism is harder than stylization because of how difficult it is to reach that benchmark for quality. On the other hand, the fact that there is such a concrete, clear, easily compared benchmark for quality is an advantage that, in other ways, makes realism much easier than stylization. While the techniques required to depict a subject in realism are significantly more complex and difficult than those required to do so in more simplified styles, there's a very well-defined set of rules an artist can follow in order to achieve objective quality in their work. No matter what a realism artist is drawing, they always have a clear, easily consulted, and understood reference to imitate, that being reality, and their sole priority is making their work look as much like that reference as possible. While they do suffer from having their work compared directly to it because most art will fall short in some way in that regard, their own ability to compare it directly to reality allows them to directly revise their work to match it. Since realism's primary objective is to imitate a real-world iteration of its subject matter as accurately as possible, it can be a negative for artists when viewers of that art compare it directly to that real-life counterpart, because its quality will be judged on how well it matches it, and any ways in which it doesn't will be immediately obvious. But when the artists themselves make that direct comparison, it allows them the same ability, but as a positive instead. They can see all of those ways it doesn't match up with reality just by comparing it to it, and as a result, they're rarely left wondering why a piece looks wrong or how to fix it. That comparison shows them exactly what's wrong, and their artistic skills then inform their ability to rectify those errors. The rules a realism artist has to follow to make technically good art may be strict and unforgiving, but they're also incredibly clear and well-defined. It's like an artistic safety net that provides them with the consistent ability to identify and fix mistakes, simply because what constitutes a mistake in realism is so abundantly obvious and widely agreed upon. Furthermore, there are established and well-understood methods to replicate reality in realism, because the rules and criteria for judging quality are so consistent and unchanging that artists are able to follow a straightforward, almost formulaic study plan to learn everything they need to be able to make good work. After all, the methods required are largely the same for every realism artist working in the same medium, so they can be reliably taught and learned the same way by most, time and time again. With stylized work, artists don't have that same safety net or clearly defined learning path. The rules of realistic interpretation are not expected nor intended to apply to stylized art, meaning that assessing what is and isn't technically correct is significantly more difficult. While realism's quality is defined by how accurately it imitates reality, stylized art's quality is so nebulously defined and identified that it can feel borderline impossible to pinpoint any consistent rules that can be followed to ensure that a piece turns out well or correctly. This is largely because the whole point of stylization is to free artists from those rules and allow them the creative freedom to exaggerate and distort any aspect of reality that they wish in their work if they feel it suits the piece or the style. And while that's immensely creatively valuable and opens the door to endless experimentation unbound by the strictness of realism, it also leaves stylized artists with very little guidance or ability to judge their own work's quality consistently. After all, a realism artist drawing a portrait can simply compare it to the subject they're drawing and immediately recognize any anatomical errors or inaccuracies and fix them. An artist doing a stylized portrait can't, because their work isn't supposed to realistically resemble that subject. If their eyes are too big or too far apart, it can be difficult to judge whether that's a deliberate stylistic exaggeration or a mistake. And looking at the subject does nothing to help us make that judgment, because the way their eyes look has little to no bearing on how they're depicted in stylized artwork. This is not, however, to say that stylized art doesn't follow any rules. It just doesn't follow a clear, pre-established, universally consistent set of rules like realism does. Some artists do choose to stylize their work in a manner that follows no rules at all, with no regard for the fundamentals at all whatsoever, but most do try to maintain a degree of consistency when it comes to what they exaggerate, how much they exaggerate it, and what aspects they choose to stylize and what aspects they choose to depict more realistically. The challenge here is that when it comes to stylized art, it's up to the artist to establish their own individual set of rules, based on both intuition and a strong enough understanding of the fundamentals to be able to bend and alter the application of those fundamentals in a way that is stylized but still coherent and visually appealing. There's essentially a delicate line that stylized artists have to walk, because they need to maintain a balance between allowing themselves the freedom to bend the rules of reality in their work in a manner that's uniquely and creatively their own, while still understanding and following those rules enough for their subject matter to be recognizable and aesthetically pleasing. If they prefer to draw characters with impossibly large eyes, for example, they need to be able to make them large enough that their individual style's impact is maintained, since it is partially defined by that size, but not so large that a viewer's suspension of disbelief would be broken because they've lost all recognizability as eyes. So essentially, while both realism and stylization require an artist to have a thorough, well-developed understanding of anatomy, proportions, color, and so on, a stylized artist needs to take it one step further by also developing an equally honed understanding of how to successfully change and exaggerate any of those elements in a way that doesn't break immersion but still conveys their creative vision for their work and the unique style they prefer to work in. They need to know how far they can push the rules of realism before breaking them altogether in a way that looks wrong or unappealing, effectively forcing them to develop their own set of rules that are completely independent from those that any other artist follows. And because stylized artists are forced to develop their own set of rules, they face the infuriatingly difficult challenge of developing them right. Yes, within certain genres or styles, there are some mostly universal rules. Within anime, for example, eyes and heads are expected to be disproportionately large to some degree, with facial features like noses and mouths often being smaller and reduced to simple lines rather than complex and thoroughly rendered shapes. But if you look at a handful of different shows, you'll find that while they all follow that same universal rule of facial exaggeration, they follow it completely differently while still falling into the anime style. How much larger an artist draws the eyes or head depends entirely on their personal preferences, and while they should generally still follow the fundamental rules of facial proportions in terms of each feature's distance from the others, the degree to which they do so is not set in stone. So an anime artist can't just look at any reference of anime art to consult when deciding how much to exaggerate facial proportions, since the way they look in that reference isn't universally correct, and it may not suit that artist's style. Even when there are some vague, nebulous guidelines each style follows to some extent, there's really no objective standard by which to evaluate the quality or accuracy of stylized work, since each style follows its own set of rules. An artist could make a deliberate stylistic choice that they like and think turned out well that follows the rules that they've established for their style, but a viewer of their work could easily see that as a mistake because they have nothing to compare it to that would suggest otherwise. They're used to seeing things as they are in reality, so inherently deviation from that in stylized work is met with some degree of scrutiny. People are more inclined to view those deviations as mistakes rather than intentional stylistic exaggerations or creative liberties, since they have no way of knowing which is the case without any clear guidelines by which to judge it, nor any knowledge of what individual rules the artist created for themselves. And just as viewers of stylized art struggle to determine what's a mistake and what's a deliberate stylistic choice without the universally understood rules of realism to inform their evaluation, artists themselves face the exact same struggle. They can't compare their work to their references to judge its quality, since some of the ways it doesn't match the reference may have been intentional to suit their style, while others could be genuine mistakes that they didn't intend for and are unable to recognize or distinguish from their stylistic choices. Comparing the facial anatomy of all of these different anime styles will do nothing to tell you if there are mistakes in any of them, because they all follow different rules and we can't ascertain with any degree of confidence based on comparison alone whether or not those rules were followed accurately. Stylized artists, as a result, are often left struggling to identify mistakes or flaws in their own work, especially if the rules that they've established for their own style aren't based firmly or consistently on the fundamentals. If they don't have a good understanding of realistic facial anatomy, the way they choose to exaggerate it in their style might appear wrong, not because they're stylized or unrealistic, but because they're stylized in a manner that deviates so far from realistic and recognizable facial anatomy that the faces themselves no longer appear adequately recognizable as faces. It's really one big balancing act, figuring out how to develop your own style's rules in a way that's creative and unique, while still basing those rules enough on the fundamentals that you're still only bending them, not breaking them altogether. It's a constant struggle to see how far you can push the boundaries of realism with your style without departing from them so far that it looks wrong. You have to understand what elements are important and necessary to be kept realistic, and what elements are free to be changed, distorted, or exaggerated. Something that takes a massive amount of time, effort, dedication, and experimentation. And to fine-tune the way you do so in your style without concrete, universal rules to follow and consult like a realism artist can, you often need to rely heavily on the feedback of others to help you see what's working and what isn't. After all, there's no consistent way to judge what is working, so it comes down to one big vibe check that's difficult to complete on your own. And my biggest and most valuable takeaway from this analysis is that that's exactly why I struggle so much drawing anime while realism comes so easily to me. I love rules. Not societally speaking, I mean obviously big do crime, but rules that give structure to the things that I'm doing and the way that I'm doing them. I will have 8 panic attacks if you give me 6 projects to complete at once, but if you give me 6 lists of clearly defined tasks that need doing in order to finish each one, I'm good. I'll get that shit done in a day. I find immense comfort in having a clear, well-defined method by which to achieve an outcome. I want everything I do to come down to a reliable, consistent formula that I can do time and time again exactly the same way with exactly the same result. I can count on that. If I can plan to do something, follow established and practiced steps to do that thing, and have following those steps produce the result that I'm aiming for every time so long as I follow them right, I'm happy. I'm in my element. Nothing pleases me more. But the moment I have to wing it, or make impulsive judgment calls, or figure out new steps to follow without knowing whether or not they'll be successful at producing the result I want, I'm lost. I'm panicked, insecure, and clumsy. When I'm drawing realism, I know exactly what to do to make the end product look how I want it to, even if that's hard, and I can practice those steps over and over to get better at them and make each end product even closer to the subject matter I'm imitating with it. It's consistent, it's clear, and while the rules that realism follows require much more complex techniques than the simpler ones required of anime or other stylized art, I'm comforted by their rigidity. I'm comforted by the knowledge that so long as I follow those steps and practice those skills and compare my work directly to my references, I will eventually be able to create a piece that looks how I want it to. When it comes to anime, I'm out of my element. I have to make my own rules, figure out my own structure, and fail a million times before learning which ones work for me, since there are no universally applicable guidelines that I can consult and rely on. It's up to me to figure out what looks right, and I can't blindly follow the comfortingly straightforward rules of realism to make that determination, or ensure that I'll get a result I enjoy. And I'm just not good at that. We're surrounded by examples of how to draw things realistically. We see faces and bodies and forms all around us, and life is really just one big walking reference for realism. For stylized work, realistic references can only be consulted to establish what's effectively a baseline. The artist then has to consult further references from their own work and that which inspires them to decide how to stylize that base reference to make their own stylized work look correct within the rules that they've established for it. And because their style is unique, the references that they consult from other artists will still not necessarily serve as anything more than a jumping off point that they'll have to revise further, and can't consult to judge accuracy. I could get one reference for a realistic portrait and be fine, consulting it consistently throughout the artistic process and succeeding in making a good piece if I imitate it correctly enough. I could consult 40 different references for an anime portrait and not be able to imitate a single one, but all of them for different aspects and to different degrees, and without any consistency in terms of how much or little to consult or revise each one. And when I'm done, I can't compare my portrait to any of those references to judge whether or not mine is good or correct, since imitating any single one of them wasn't the goal, and mine shouldn't look like theirs even if it's done perfectly. I have to judge it based on my own interpretation, preferences, and understanding of how much I can bend certain rules without outright breaking them. And all of that is so vague, ever-changing, and constantly undefined that it means never feeling confident in my assessments of my work's quality like I am with my realistic art. It's not clear what's wrong or how to fix it when I'm drawing anime because there are no clear rules establishing what's wrong and what's right, something I rely so heavily on to make my realism as good as it can be. For some, that creative freedom is nothing but comforting and exciting and promising, allowing them to experiment with new techniques and concepts as much as they want. For me and other artists like me that prefer the clear-cut rigidity of having straightforward rules that can consistently be followed to achieve high levels of quality based solely on how well you follow them, it's terrifying to effectively have none. And in that regard, I would argue that stylization is much, much harder than realism, especially if you're someone who thrives more with guidance and structure than complete freedom. At the end of the day, no one can objectively say one way or the other if one type of art is harder than another, since its difficulty will largely come down to the individual artist's skills, preferences, and even personality. All that I can say is that while the techniques required of realism may be objectively more difficult to utilize well than those of more simplified stylized art forms, that doesn't mean that simplified stylization doesn't present its own plethora of unique difficulties that are not present within realism. Both require artists to develop a high level of technical proficiency and understanding of the fundamentals, but stylization requires them to take it another fairly gigantic step further by using that understanding to learn an entirely new skill, balancing unique creative expression in the form of exaggerating elements unrealistically in a way that demonstrates your individual style, with maintaining enough realistic elements that it remains recognizable and visually appealing. Within realism, you need to know the rules. Within stylization, you need to know them so well that you can break them right. Or, to stick with the metaphor I've been using so far, bend them just enough without breaking them. And that's a very difficult skill to learn. Is it more difficult than learning the immensely more complex techniques required of realism? I have no idea. That depends almost entirely on each each individual artist, and it can't be quantified with any degree of objectivity. I can't give you a concrete conclusion as to whether any of this means anime art is harder than realism or not. All I can say is that each present their own difficulties, and which one will present more comes down almost solely to what you struggle with most. And if nothing else, I can also say that while I can't claim anime art and other forms of stylization are harder than realism just because I now understand why they are for me, it's a lot harder than many realize. To claim realism is objectively more difficult than stylization just because it is on a technical level is to also entirely disregard how much harder it is than realism on a conceptual level, minimizing the unique struggles that stylized artists face that so often go overlooked. But what do you guys think? I've heard from a lot of people that artists who started with realism like me have a much harder time switching to stylized art than those who started with stylized art and then switched to realism, mostly because they were taught so strictly to follow universal and unwavering rules that the thought of breaking, bending, or even questioning them is sincerely alarming. But is that the case for you guys? I'm obviously limited to the perspective of someone who did start with realism, so I'm especially curious to hear the thoughts of artists on the opposite end of that spectrum, because I'm sure they're very different. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Devarag42, Haruki Saluzzo, King Good James, Cutie Sailor Lovely, CP Little Thing, Art of Amethyst Fable, Extinction Animation, and Endy the Hedgehog, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Alengshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Yasar, Gentong, Grayson Xavier, MG, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Allura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Captain Reku, Ryan M. Williams, Catbus, Alec Reinekainen, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Bibi, Friday, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Lola the Pinky, Wing Tang Wong, and Yosue Garnizo, and I'll see you in the next one.